Thank you for tuning in to the Voice of the Victim podcast. We discuss a lot of sad and potentially triggering things on this show. We try to be as sensitive and cautious as possible, but if you are sensitive to things involving abuse and may be triggered, please think twice before listening to our show.
Welcome to the Voice of the Victim podcast. I'm Ryan.
And I'm Rosie. First of all, we want to say thank you to our newest patrons, Cassidy, Megan, Claire, or Mrs. Monster, and Andrea.
I hope it's Andrea. Dang it, we should have asked. Andrea or Andrea. It's hard to tell. But anyway, thank you guys so much. Cassidy, Megan, Claire, Andrea or Andrea. Oh, we're going to get another bad review.
Oh, stop.
But before we get into our listener story for the week, we have a pretty long intro with announcements and us discussing some things before we play the interview. So first, Rosie, you were on the Peripheral this week.
I was. And Burrito is on the podcast this week.
Hey, Burrito. But yeah, most of our listeners know your story, but if you don't and you're listening, you can either hear it on episode 18 of our podcast or over on the Peripheral, episode 60, which just came out this week. And we definitely recommend you go listen to that because he actually covered 3 different stories.
Or just skip over mine and listen to theirs because I feel like I sound like a mutt butt.
Mutt butt?
Uh-huh.
What's that?
It's a dog with a dirty butt.
Well, I thought you sounded really good. And anyways, all 3 of the stories were based on statutory rape. And I really appreciated the stories from Kara and Tiffany. They both had a huge impact on me. And I know that if you enjoy our show, you'll really appreciate this latest episode. Tiffany's story was actually kind of shocking.
It was insane.
Yeah, just the contrasting ways her parents have interacted with her after the fact and the way her religious community handled it all. I don't want to spoil anything yet in case you haven't heard it, but I would like to discuss it in more detail at some point because it was fascinating. I learned a lot between the statute of limitations at the time and the way religious organizations might sweep illegal activities, especially child abuse, under the rug and quote-unquote deal with it themselves. What did you think of that, Rosie?
Man, it was very interesting. I mean, that story was really crazy. It was a hook and sinker for me. I don't want to, give anything away, though.
Yeah, we're trying not to spoil it, but saying, go listen to it.
But yeah, that was very, very interesting.
Yeah, we know that our audience will appreciate those stories. So definitely go listen to that. And speaking of the Peripheral, Justin's other show also hit me really hard this week. And again, I don't want to spoil that either. But if you haven't heard Generation Y's latest episode, definitely go listen to it. In the near future, I really wanted to do an episode on the history of lynching because it really wasn't that long ago that it was happening right here in the U.S., and it really hit me a few weeks ago when we were in Duluth at the Glensheen Mansion, and they had those information boards up in the basement about the history of lynch mobs in Duluth, Minnesota. And that was when it really hit me that 60, 70 years ago, it really isn't that long. You know, the case that Gen Y talked about this week was in the 50s. And when we were in Duluth at the Glensheen, it broke my heart. Rosie, do you remember that little black girl that was seeing the boards while we were standing there?
I do.
She saw the photos that were up in the basement there, and there was this one photo in the streets of Duluth, and she asked her mom, "What is that? And why are they doing that?" And her poor mom was visibly uncomfortable because she wasn't prepared to have to explain these horrible things to her daughter this day, you know? They were just there having a nice family day.
And she was little. She was probably 6 or 7.
Yeah. And the mom just kept telling her, this is what they used to do. And it broke my heart to listen to this. And the little girl's confusion about why the black people were tied up. She was just like, but why? And it was really sad. So I found the story of the people that were in that particular photo, and I just wanted to share a summary of it with you because this past Wednesday was Juneteenth, June 19th. And if you don't know, it's the anniversary of when slavery was abolished in the South. So it's a big deal. They're trying to make it a federal holiday. But Rosie, will you share the story of the people in the photo we saw from Duluth?
Sure, but first, do you remember how the little girl and the mom, they were African American, but the dad wasn't, and he was being such a turd, remember?
Yeah, I was going to leave that out because I don't want to malign anybody, but yeah, he was talking about how...
He was like, they still do that to his little girl. I'm like, why are you... I mean, she's so little, and this is freaking her out so bad. Why are you telling her?
Yeah, and the mom was like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? And he didn't really have an answer. They're just kind of gotten into an argument. But
that was super awkward.
Anyway, yeah, which is sad because it just shows really how uneducated a lot of people are about this situation. I mean, I don't really know a whole lot about it right now, which is why I want to do an episode on it and do the research and spread awareness of the actual history and what's actually still happening. Racism in the United States,
Right.
But anyway, I just want to share this other story quick before we jump into our interview. So will you go through that?
Yes. On June 14th, 1920, the John Robinson Circus came to Duluth, Minnesota for a parade and a one-day performance. They hired a lot of local people to work as day laborers for the circus while it was in town. A teenage white couple attended the circus that day. They were 19-year-old Irene Tuscan and 18-year-old James Sullivan. Later, James Sullivan told his father that something horrific had happened at the circus. He said that after the planned events of the circus had ended, the couple wandered around the grounds and ended up behind some of the tents. Then he said that the couple was held up at gunpoint by 3 black circus workers, and they had raped Irene. James' father immediately got in touch with Irene's father to let him know what had happened. The next day, her father reported this to the local police.
And at the time, the chief of police in Duluth was John Murphy, and his reaction was pretty insane.
John Murphy immediately rounded up 100 local black people who had been hired by the circus and made them line up for James and Irene to identify the attackers. They identified at least 6 men.
So, they had originally said there were 3 perpetrators, but somehow they identified 6 men? It's true that in a violent rape, it would be really hard to identify an attacker, but according to the story, James was also watching when she was attacked, and it's just kind of weird that they couldn't agree on the 3 people that they were identifying, But then another detail came out.
Irene's father took her to the doctor, but the doctor found no evidence of any physical assault or rape. Despite only identifying 6 men, 16 black men were arrested and thrown into the Duluth City Jail. News spread around town quickly, and before long, a huge mob of around 5,000 people were angrily making their way toward the jail. They were carrying makeshift tools, and they stormed and broke into the jail. But the Commissioner of Public Safety ordered the officers and guards not to use any force against the people to stop them from entering.
So essentially, these people are burglarizing and trespassing on a jail, but the local law enforcement weren't doing anything to stop it?
The mob broke into 3 cells, dragging Elmer Clayton, Isaac McGee, and Elmer Jackson out of the jail and onto the streets. The 3 men pleaded for their lives while the crowd held a mock trial.
Yeah, quote-unquote mock trial. And they were all found guilty with absolutely no evidence. And so the mob dragged them up the street to the town square, and they were hanged.
And this is just so disgusting. A local photographer took a picture of the horrifying scene, and it became a postcard keepsake.
Yeah, and this is the photo that was in the basement of the Glensheen mansion that this little girl saw that we were talking about earlier. And you can see it if you just Google Duluth lynching. It's the first result, and it's really disturbing. But the crazy part is there was no proof that a crime actually happened in the first place, but 16 men were arrested, and 3 of them ended up murdered. But somehow it continues to get worse from there.
For the lynching, 37 white men were indicted, but only 3 of them were actually convicted of anything. And it wasn't for murder, it was only for inciting a riot. And they only got 1 year each.
Yeah, 1 year each for taking part in murder. Now, there was plenty of evidence for probably all 37 of these white men to be found as first-degree murderers. I mean, this all happened in public. Everyone saw what was happening and that these men murdered these 3 black men. But what about the black men that were imprisoned for a crime with no evidence?
7 of the black men were indicted and served up to 4 years each.
Yeah, so they were found guilty of the attack that there was no proof of. 7 of them, even though originally there were only 3 perpetrators of the alleged crime with no proof. Yet somehow 7 men get convicted and have to serve 4 times the amount of time the men who murdered these 3 black men served. It's a mind bender, and no matter which way you look at it, it's such a terrible and gross injustice. And this was only 100 years ago, and in the grand scheme of time, that's not very long ago. Right now, the U.S. Senate is actually considering a resolution to make June 19th a federal holiday. So we already mentioned earlier what Juneteenth is, but Rosie, do you want to read a quick official description for us?
Yes. Juneteenth, also known as Juneteenth Independence Day or Freedom Day, is an American holiday that commemorates the June 19th, 1865 announcement of the abolition of slavery in the U.S. state of Texas, and more generally, the emancipation of enslaved African Americans throughout the former Confederate States of America.
Yeah, so we just thought this was something important to think about, and definitely recommend that you also go listen to episode 332 of Generation Y to hear the story of Emmett Till. It's another really moving story about racism and violence, and it's just crazy and sad to think that this stuff has happened so recently, and that it is still happening today. A lot of things we don't know about, you know?
Right. Yeah, that was a terrifying picture, and even to me, even more terrifying than seeing those men dead, hanging, was seeing the faces of the people that did it. How they were so proud. It was just
they were just smiling and happy. There were kids and
absolutely disgusting.
Ugh.
It was so scary. That gave me nightmares.
Yeah. Like, what kind of culture were they raising their kids in to have so much hate for other people? It's definitely something important to think about and to be understanding of why a lot of people are still sensitive about this, because it wasn't that long ago. So anyway, we want to talk about that more in the future, but we're going to get into our listener interview now. We're actually releasing our listener interview a week earlier than we were planning because we have a couple of really thick and heavy stories that we're working on, and I needed a little more time for research to do them the justice they deserve. So those are taking a little longer for me to research. We already had this interview recorded, so yeah, we're going to be sharing that with you this week.
And also, we want to quickly remind you that we are going to be in Chicago in just a few weeks for the True Crime Podcast Festival. And that's on July 13th in Chicago at the Magnificent Mile Marriott
downtown.
So be sure to check that out at tcpf2019.com.
Awesome. So we talked to Mia from Australia. She has a beautiful accent that we were both very
hypnotized by.
Yes. So that's who we're talking to this week.
Now let's jump into our interview with Mia.
So I was raised by my grandmother from the age of 3. My mum and dad split when I was 3, and my dad got custody of me. Back in that time, I'd like to say I'm still 21, but I know I'm not. So we're talking about in the 80s. Mum had to have done something pretty shocking to have lost custody of her child, but that was never divulged to me. But it was hinted towards, as I got a bit older, especially when my grandmother had been drinking a few drinks and sort of would like to tell me some things. So at that point, my mum, she decided to step out of my life. She decided that I was better off without her, and unfortunately, I never actually got a chance to get to know her. She passed away when I was 15. So I was then primarily raised by my grandmother. I would go to my dad's on the weekends and stay with my nan during the week, and she'd be responsible for getting me off to school, making sure I was looked after, making sure I had everything I needed. And I can remember some very hairy times with my dad on the weekends where he would go to parties and I'd crash out on the lounge and I'd wake up back in my bed at home. So knowing my dad's probably driven drunk home and, all that sort of thing. This, back in the 80s. So in regards to my grandmother, I can never remember exactly when the abuse started. It was probably always there. During the day, my nan was the loveliest lady. She'd do anything for anyone. She'd give their last dollar if she could. But after 4 p.m., she'd start drinking. So I always refer to it as a Jekyll and Hyde. She became a very different person after 4. I unfortunately, or should say fortunately, developed a coping strategy of not being able to actually remember what happened from the previous night. I could tell you the next day that I'd had a rough night the night before, but I couldn't tell you what happened. The only things I can sort of remember is that I was always on edge. I had to watch everything I'd say. I dare not say a word or she'd explode. I was told daily that I was not wanted, that I would turn out just like my mother. As much as I was not physically abused, it was mostly verbal. I'd often wish at times that I was hit so I could actually feel physical pain. So then the pain would go away. But after, many years of dealing with it, well, I ended up in a situation where I had called on my dad to see if he could help me get out of there. And his situation didn't accommodate for me to move in with him. So I realised that I had to save myself, I guess. So when I was 16, I moved out of home to escape the abuse. It took me many years to heal from all the hurt and dealing with what I had to grow up. But the one thing I'd always promised myself that I'd never allow anyone to treat me that way again. Inevitably, I tried to recreate this happy family that I thought I should have had growing up. So by the time I was 21, I had 2 kids and I'd divorced twice. After a lot of work on myself, I finally forgave my nan. One of the things I'd come to realise over the years and having grown up a little bit was that she had her own demons. She'd struggled with a horrendous childhood. She'd gone through domestic violence through her adult years, and she just had horrible situation after horrible situation. And someone one day said to me that the reason she was drinking was because that was her way of dealing with what she went through. And when I look at what she went through, it was an awful lot worse than whatever I did. So the good thing about being able to reflect on that, I was also able to look at the fact she was a very loving and affectionate person when she was sober. I actually felt loved, and I felt secure. I never felt like I was doing without during the day. And also to realise that the abuse was not actually about me. It was her deflecting how she felt about herself. Then I was actually able to heal. This didn't happen until after my second marriage. And, I spent a bit of time on my own, and I started to look at why I kept thinking that marriage and all these kids was the option that I needed to have to create the happy family that I thought I needed. So after this time, I realised that one, marriage wasn't for me, that men weren't actually going to be the solution to my problems. So when I finally did get back to starting to date, it was never about needing to have a man in my life. It was about they were an added extra. So and I was always very cautious of men that came into my life, purely because as a child, at the age of 7, I was molested twice by 2 different people. One was a babysitter and the other one was a friend's brother. So I had a fair idea of the sinister things that were out there and the type of people that were around. So any guy I ever dated, I watched like a hawk. My kids had locks on their doors at night so that I knew that they were always safe behind those doors. So really, the story that I'm telling today is not actually about my abuse because, as I said before, there's not an awful lot that I could actually tell you because I don't remember a lot of it. I just know that it happened. But this is actually my story about what it's like to be a parent of a child who'd been molested. So I'm going to tell this part of my story in perspective of how this affected me. This is no reflection of my son and his experiences. I do have permission to talk about this from him. He's okay with that. And I've also, run through with him what exactly I'm going to say. So I'm going to start the story back on 2 years ago when I actually found out my son was 19. For many years, he'd been struggling with mental health issues. He'd started medication for depression and he'd started counselling. He'd just started dating a girl from his school, and the girlfriend had been dealing with her own demons, which included being raped at a party one night. She'd spent a lot of their time talking about how this had affected her and how it impacted their relationship. So on my son's last counselling appointment, he told the counsellor what had happened to him. At this stage, I had no real idea about anything. I had a slight idea that something didn't seem right, but I would ask my son and he would deny everything. At this appointment, and with the support of his girlfriend, he told me that a close family friend of ours had been having sex with him since he was 9 years old.
Oh, wow.
I can remember sitting there, I was shocked. At this stage, we had broken contact with this man as I'd been feeling on edge about his attention to my son. One night when my son was 14, this man had come over and he was very drunk. And in a conversation, he asked me once that when my son turned 18, would it be okay if he could date him?
Oh, wow.
And I thought I thought he was joking, and I laughed it off at the time, but it still played in my mind.
How old was this man?
He was the same age as me at the time, so he would have been in his mid-30s. Yeah, he was very drunk, and I just thought, that'd be funny because it would depend on if my son was even going to turn out gay. And I had a lot of respect for this man because he'd done what I had perceived as so much for my son, and not realising that there was sinister motives for it. So I asked my son if anything had ever happened, and he said no. So I was still on edge about it, and I didn't feel comfortable with him around my son, and we'd actually moved away. So the last contact we'd had with him was when my son was 16. So we didn't have any contact between 14 and 16. And my son asked if he could stay the night at this man's house after we'd been there for dinner. I asked him if he felt safe and comfortable to do it. And I kept thinking, well, this guy's decent enough that he would never approach my son until he was of legal age, and that my son then could consent, because I always raised my children to make their own choices. I didn't want them to ever feel like they had to get my approval for anything. It was whatever choice they chose was the consequences they'd have to live with. So I wasn't going to, prejudge any situation other than, if my son was underage. So the night of the dinner, while we're having dinner with this man and his partner, I kept asking my son if he was comfortable to stay. And he said he was. So now I'm sure there's probably many people out there who are thinking, how could this woman be so stupid to leave her son where he was at risk? Believe me, I ask myself that every day. This man in my eyes was an uncle figure to my son. As my son has always been different, he went through all his schooling with dyslexia. He was bullied a lot at school. There was a lot of questions if he was on the spectrum, as if he had a few oddities about him that made it hard for people to get close to him. And we had very little family around except my ex-husband, which was my son's dad. Then entered this man into my ex-husband's life. He was this fun-loving neighbour who seemed to understand my son and had so much time for him. I was so pleased that finally someone could see what a loving and beautiful soul my boy has. He would make so much time for my son, and I didn't see anything sinister in it at all. My son was living at his dad's place at that stage when he was 9. His dad worked a lot of late hours, and this man happily put his hand up to look after him until his dad got home from work. This is when my son said the sexual abuse started. So flash forward many years later, I was talking to someone about this man. And this was around the time my son was about 17. And it was after the last time we had contact with him. And I sort of talked to this person about how I'd felt uncomfortable with his attention to my son, described what had happened and the dynamic of it all. And this person looked me in the eye and he just said, he was grooming your son. And it was like this light switched on. Suddenly everything fell into place. It was so hard to explain, but without a doubt, I knew this man had been grooming my son. By this point, my son was about 17. I asked him again if anything had happened, and he'd said no again. I could sense there was more to what had happened, but the more I tried to push my son, the more he shut down. So I just sat back and I waited until he was ready to talk. But in the meantime, I'd organised him counselling and mental health plans, which over here in Australia, a mental health plan is a system set up by our health system called Medicare, where they will pay for 10 visits to a psychologist or a counsellor, for the year. And as long as you can show signs of depression or anxiety or something to do with mental health. So back to 2 years ago when he finally told me, he did it over a series of 3 days. He'd only talked to me when we were in the car and he was driving. He always found it was less confrontational if he was able to have this conversation while not looking at me. Mm-hmm. Right. I slowly managed to get him to open up. I had to be very careful about the questions that I asked, as I didn't want him to close back up. It had taken this long for him to finally feel comfortable to talk to me. He told me of the 7 years of sexual abuse from this man, and in the last year, the man's partner joined in as well. I asked my son, did this man actually ever threaten him to not tell us? And he'd said no, but he was so scared that if he told us, he'd stop getting the attention. And at that point, I was working all the time. I was studying. His dad was always, working. And I thought that that was the best thing, that I was supporting my family and I was supporting my kids. I was a sole parent, even though I had a lot of support from my ex-husband, and not realising that it left my kids feeling alone a lot. So, and also my son's dad was dealing with his own demons at that point too. So he was often very distant even when he was home. So this man found a way to make my son feel special so that he would agree to everything he wanted from him. I'd also asked my son that if I hadn't always been working, if this ever would have happened, and he said possibly no. Now, I don't want to talk about how my son felt about any of this. I'm talking from my perspective of what it's like to be the parent who finds out. I can never discuss or describe how my son feels because that's just doing a disservice to what he's going through. And he does still struggle with this to this day. So for myself, I was heartbroken. Even in the last contact with this man, I was feeling uneasy about his attention to my son. But I still found it so hard to accept what had happened to him. Over a few days of talking to many people who were close to me, I started to process it and I became extremely angry. I wanted to rip this man apart and I wanted to march into the nearest police station and report him, but my son was not ready for that. I watched him become lighter though. He seemed to have this weight lifted off his shoulders. He'd finally shared his secret, but he also didn't want to discuss it any further. He didn't want to go back to counselling and he didn't want to go to the police. He just wanted to forget it ever happened. Then slowly his mental health started deteriorating. I didn't know what I could do for him. I could see him hurting, but I couldn't get him to open up. As for myself, I became withdrawn from everyone. I started withdrawing from my 4-year-old. I was so scared I couldn't protect her. I got so anxious in public spaces when I couldn't see my youngest. It was, even when she was in playgrounds, I hated her going into tunnels where I couldn't see her. I was a nervous wreck and I couldn't help my son. So I made the decision that I needed to help myself. I started counselling. I remember many sessions just crying and telling her about my guilt. As for my son, the guilt was always there. I couldn't help him, so I sent him up to his dad's in hope that being around his dad might help him. Then one night I got a call from my son, and he just finished watching the show 13 Reasons Why, the second season. And I'd also just finished watching it myself about 10 minutes before he rang, so I knew he could be struggling. So I asked him if he was okay, and he broke down and said no. I asked him what part of it had been affecting him. Was it the suicide or was it the sexual assault? And he said it was the sexual assault. Then he sobbed, and I was so helpless. At that point, I was living 3 hours away from him, and all I wanted to do was hop in my car and get to him. Instead, I chose to listen to him. That night, he told me in detail what had happened to him, and it broke my heart that my sweet little boy had been through this. We talked for a long time. I managed to talk him off the ledge and get him to calm down. He said to me that none of what happened to him was my fault because he was worried. He was scared that I was blaming myself. And I said to him, I don't blame myself for what this man did, as that's on this evil man's conscience. But what I will always blame myself for is that I didn't notice. So flash forward to now, everything's a lot better. I actually quit my job of working shift work and being away from the family all the time so that I could retrain. I'm now retraining to be a community services worker. I wanted to be able to help my son as best I can and to maybe one day help other families who are going through this. My son is back living with me, and he's here actually while I'm doing this interview. He doesn't want to talk, but he's okay with me sharing his story from my perspective. It's going to be a long support, but he's got some great family support here. He has his older sister who is also training to be a community services worker, and the reason that she said that she wanted to do that was because she wanted to help her brother when she saw him struggling with his mental health. So he's now getting 2 qualified people. They're going to be hopefully able to help him, further. So that's our story, or at least the story from my perspective.
Wow. First of all, tell him thank you from us that he let you share the story, and it is fascinating to get this different perspective, and it seems like the biggest thing you struggled with is feeling bad that you didn't notice what was going on.
It's all these small things, and it wasn't until that friend of mine had said to me, this man is grooming your son, that everything that was so plain and simple and was out there just suddenly fell into place. Like I had been so super vigilant to every guy that came into my house that I was in a relationship with, thinking that my kids were at risk from these men. And it turned out it came from left of centre, where it came from someone else who I wasn't in a relationship with, and someone that I had encouraged my son to have this relationship with because I thought this man saw him as a nephew, and it was it was the hardest part, was that I had encouraged it because I saw someone who saw the best in my child, and not realizing that he actually had sinister motives.
And it really shows how hard it is to identify that, and how manipulative people can be to get what they want.
Having dealt with what I went through growing up, and with what my son's gone through, and now with studying, working with children at risk, you see it all the time. They talk about the stereotypical pedophile, and I could literally tick all the boxes with this man. He got us on side, us as parents. He made us feel confident with him and made us believe that he only had my son's best interest at heart. He then got my son on his side, and he offered my son, he found my son's weakness, which was that my son was lonely. He was always, doing everything from, he was a very independent child. I had worked, I've always worked. I'm the type of person that seems to thrive when I'm working. I'm definitely not a housewife. So going to work was what I thought was best for my family, and this person just saw that as an opportunity of picking his victim, and targeting him and getting him on side. And it wasn't until I drew my ex-husband's attention to my concerns about this man grooming him. My ex-husband said, well, there's been concerns of this man with other children. And I was like, well, why didn't you connect that there was a risk with your own son? He didn't find out these risks, about these other children until after our son had grown up. But this man's still actually out there and still having contact with people, which is so scary.
This kind of thing can ruin people's lives and cause them to give up and stuff, but you've used it as a way to learn and to get stronger when you're helping other people deal with it. And even you said your daughter's also working.
Yeah, my oldest as well. Yeah, and she wants to, work with children that are at risk. For me, I think, I initially I needed to do the study to understand what happened and to understand why I felt the way I did, and then it actually became a passion for me. And I'd love to work with children at risk, but I'd also love to work with, families. I'd love to be support to some other parents who have been through this, because, how does a parent ever process what has happened when they've not been the perpetrator? If they've been victimised in the sense that they've been used and targeted for their children. And I mean, like, for me personally, I would not consider dating anyone anymore. Not even that came from that angle. I just have no trust of anyone. I have my daughter, my youngest is now 6, and I just wouldn't even consider introducing anyone into our family that could potentially abuse her, because I just have no trust of anyone anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you're a good mom, putting your children first like that.
Yeah, and with that thought of what if I had done that the first time? It's then perhaps this person wouldn't have got in. But a lot of the research that I've done, a lot of the people that I've listened to, I listen to a lot of podcasts about victims and pedophiles, and that, he would have found another way in. Like, as much as I think that I probably could have stopped it, I think he would have found some other way to win his way.
Mm-hmm. Sure. I really applaud you. I mean, you felt the guilt, and it must have been just terrible being a mother. But instead of just feeling the guilt, you really took it to your stride, going on to help protect other people. I really applaud you for that, Mia.
Yeah, and I mean, like, my main focus at the moment, too, is still protecting my son.
Mm-hmm.
We're doing a lot of work with him. His mental health has, it's up and down. He has his good days. He has his bad. He suffers anxiety now. He can't be in a room with a male. He gets very anxious. He struggles to talk to people. For example, we had a mental health appointment today, and he really struggled with being comfortable talking to a complete stranger. But he's making steps, and he's wanting to help himself and allow us to help him as well. So whereas a year and a half ago, I couldn't even get him to talk to anyone about it.
Well, you and your daughter seem like the best support system for him now.
Yeah.
All the things you've been trying to do.
Often, every day, sends him a message telling him how much she loves him. She's unfortunately a bit more bossy than me, and she sort of tells him what he has to do. Whereas I at least try to give him an option.
Typical of the older sister, though.
Yeah.
In the same way.
Definitely. Well, I think, at the end of the day, that's her personality, and I'm a little bit more sort of allowing him to sort of make his way in this path, just knowing that we're all beside him to do it.
One really important thing that, just from listening to you, that's running through my head is, even if you were as educated as you are now for identifying those signs, the real perpetrator, the person that's causing the problem, is the abuser. And you can't always stop them, and it's not the fault of anyone that may have been able to notice and try to stop it. It's the fault of the perpetrator, and it's important to remember that that's where the blame should lie, and people should never blame themselves for it.
And I think, too, one of the things that I'm identifying is that the more people I talk to about it, because I'm very open about my story and whatever's happened to me, the more I talk to people, the more I find people that have been through the same thing. And devastatingly, there's so many people that have experienced the same thing. You know, my son was lucky. He had a family who was stood behind him. I've got friends whose family didn't. You know, they just didn't believe them.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I think that's one thing my son's grateful for, is that we have his back. You know, at no point has he ever felt like he was not going to be believed. You know, and I don't know if we'll ever be able to do anything or take it any further. I have actually been, has been suggested that over here we have what's called FACS, which is Family and Children's Services. And I can actually put a report in to them about this person. And as much as they can't like prosecute him or anything, he will at least be flagged. So that if his name comes up in conjunction to any other cases, then there's a possibility that they'll be able to sort of maybe come and confirm with us, or it'll show that he's got a record or a history of doing these things. At this point, I think sadly, there's not enough done with victims who do come forward to get charges put against their perpetrators, because one, like even as my son said when he first told me, was how could I prove it? You know, this happened, well, now it'll be 5 years ago. Yeah, 5 years ago was probably the last contact we had with this person. But, you know, it's not like as a 9-year-old he sat there writing things down or getting proof of any of this.
Yeah.
So how it would be his word against my son's, and I just don't think he's strong enough or prepared to do it at this point. So, you know, as I say, that the only option we've got at the moment is to at least put the report into FACS and have some kind of record there that that has happened.
We really appreciate you talking about this, because, I mean, you're a really great example of being a good support system for your son and even your daughter too. Like, just the fact that you are so supportive and you believed him and you did everything you could to help after the fact. That's something that's so important, because you can't always prevent these things from happening. If the perpetrator will find a way, unfortunately, but
you know, they're very conniving and they find a way to weasel their way in. But they look for someone who's an easy target, you know, and they just think that he was an easy target. He was at home often on his own.
Being that support system is really important, and we really appreciate hearing that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, I think I just wanted to perhaps also give victims an understanding of perhaps why their parents acted a certain way when they were told. For me, it took quite a few days to process it, you know, and my reactions were that he needed to take action and he needed to do all this. And it wasn't because I was trying to force my son into doing anything. It was because I wanted to make sure this man came to be punished. But you know, once I had a chance to process it and back off a little bit, I realised that wasn't the right sort of thing for my son. So, and I don't think any parent could ever prepare themselves for this ever happening. Like, I had been, again, as I said, super vigilant about it, and it still ended up happening. Mm. Definitely, it was probably one of the hardest things in my entire life. Even the abuse that I'd gone through was nothing compared to knowing that one of your children's been hurt.
Well, it shows that you really love your kids.
Yeah,
that's really nice to see.
I'm so happy that we got the perspective. Well, I'm not happy, but I think it's really important to have the perspective of a parent. We haven't gotten that.
It's often, and I'm not saying that well, my experience is anything compared to what a victim goes through, but it's just a different perspective of another person in the whole scenario.
It's an important perspective.
These parents who've been made a fool of, I guess, that's at least how I felt. You know, I've been a victim as well, but not anywhere near the degree that my son has. But I've definitely, you know, been used to access my child.
Yeah, well,
We really appreciate you talking to us.
You're welcome.
I personally really enjoyed listening to you talk.
Yes, we love your accent. And I'm sure you hate ours because it's terrible.
Mine's a bit of a mix. I'm actually originally from New Zealand, and but I live in Australia.
That's why
So
Ryan loves New Zealand.
Yeah, I get given a bit of flack from everyone because I speak to someone in New Zealand, they say I sound like an Aussie, and I speak to someone in Australia and they say I sound like a Kiwi. So
funny. New Zealand accents are my favorite. Like,
yeah.
I don't know if you've seen the Avengers movies or Thor Ragnarok, but I love the Korg character, the rock guy.
Yeah, my son's gesturing over here at the moment, going, "Yes, his favourite movies."
Oh, sweet, me too.
Yeah. Well, thanks for giving me a chance to have sort of talk about what it was like, and to share my story.
Yeah, thank you for being willing to.
We want to say thank you again to Mia for sharing your story with us.
Yeah, it was really nice to get this different perspective and really understand how easily a parent can be manipulated and used to get to their child. It's definitely something to be on the lookout for. So we really appreciate you being vulnerable and sharing it with us, Mia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, loved this perspective. So interesting and so educational for our listeners.
Yeah, it's a perspective that some of our other listeners might relate to.
Mm-hmm.
And we also want to apologize because it was like 8 a.m. when we did our call with her. So we were both pretty not fully socially ready yet. But we did our best. And
can you go
Mia was pretty great.
Without apologizing? I think not.
Huh. I don't think I can, no.
No. Well, Mia, keep up the great work on trying to make a difference in the future of your family and others.
Now we're going to get into the review portion of the show. And this week, I think we're actually going to start sharing 2 reviews per show.
What?
Because we've been getting so many that we'll never share them all if we don't start doing 2. So.
Okay. Cool.
But that is not to discourage you from leaving a review if you haven't yet. Feel free to leave us a review if you want to.
5-star review or negative contents in our email.
Yeah. Right? I don't know if what you just said makes sense.
I'll figure it out.
Okay. All right. So I'll share the first review. It's entitled Addictive from Jackie in the Low Country of the United States. She or he, I'm thinking she, but who knows? Jackie could go either way.
Yeah.
Says this podcast always starts out with warnings for sensitive listeners. They should warn you that you will become addicted. I love that. It continues. I'm trying to catch up on all the old shows, and it'll be like a Netflix series. When I catch up, I'll be impatient to have to wait for only one new show a week to come out. I hear that. I've tried out a lot of podcasts, and really most of them I just can't stand. But Rosie and Ryan are a wonderful team. They aren't weird. Wow. We've never heard that before. Thank you. They aren't weird, showy, or vulgar. They are sensitive, down-to-earth people you feel you'd love having as your next-door neighbors. Love your podcasts. 5 stars. Thank you so much, Jackie. That's really sweet.
Very much so. We enjoyed that a lot.
Yeah, I love that. They start out with a warning for sensitive listeners, but they should warn you that you will become addicted.
Boom-ching.
I love it.
All right, the next one is entitled Love Them. Says, this is such a great podcast. Their message in focusing on the victims, not the perpetrators, is so important. It's like you are talking to your very knowledgeable best friends. This is my favorite podcast. You guys are the best. We'll order a t-shirt soon. From Taylor Law via Apple Podcasts, United States.
Awesome. Thank you, Taylor. I love these reviews that say it's like you'd love having as your next door neighbors, or they're like your best friends. Like, we really appreciate that, because sometimes we hear that we waffle on a little too much about our own personal lives. Mm-hmm. And, I know that may be true, but we feel like it's connected us to you guys a little more. And if you appreciate that type of thing, you're the type of person that we want listening to our show. So thank you guys for saying these things. That's what we really want while we're doing this show, is to form personal connections to you guys and bring these stories to life in a way that you can feel what's happening in them, you know? And what better way than to hear it from a friend? So
There you go.
yeah. Well, thank you guys all so much for listening and your feedback. Thank you again to our patrons. You guys are so great. If you're new here, you can follow us on Instagram at VoV Podcast and on Twitter at VoV Pod, or email us at vovpodcast@gmail.com.
We're going to check out our Threadless store for shirts.
Yes.
And we're going to order more merch so we can get our Patreon envelopes out soon.
Yes. We will be sending out Patreon packages after the first of the month. So if you haven't gotten yours yet, and it's been a while, it will be coming. We
Don't
promise.
fret.
There was one more. Oh yeah, you said Threadless store.
Mm-hmm.
There is a link to that in our show notes every week. But if you aren't sure, it's just vovpodcast.threadless.com. And we've gotten some questions about what that is. So, yeah, it's pretty simple. Is there anything else? Oh, join our Facebook group, Voice of the Victim Support System. And I think that's about it.
Yep, I want to have my candy now, so.
Yep. All right. Well, thank you again for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Bye.